Well, Dr. Ayo Teriba, economist and CEO, Economic Associates, joins me now via Skype. Good morning, and thank you for joining us on TVC Breakfast. Talk to us. What was the most striking for you when you looked through this policy recommendations by Bola Ahmed Tinubu?
Good morning. Right. Nigeria has announced restrictions on movement of people. We have announced restrictions on association of people. Both freedom of movement and freedom of association are expressly guaranteed within Nigerian laws. But for the reason of the pandemic, to contain the spread of this disease, it has been considered expedient, not just by the Nigerian government, but by governments around the world, to suspend those, freedoms of movement or of association. So what the national leader is advocating is to say that if you could suspend the freedom of movement of people and the freedom of association, you should also relax the limits imposed by you on spending or incurring deficit in the period of the lockdown. So I do think that this, the suggestions largely should have been taken on board at the time that we were announcing the lockdown. Now, so the government needs to move very fast, on doing those things, prevent a social backlash, it's important to emphasize that much of those recommendations relate to the period of the lockdown and should end once the lockdown ends. However, there are calls for in the special circumstances that we find ourselves, and I don't think we should be debating whether laws should be relaxed or we didn't modify the constitution before we restricted people's movement. We didn't modify the constitution before we restricted people's associations. So there's no need to modify any law. We should invoke the same, emergency situation and say it is expedient for the government to spend extra budgetary. The US has approved $2 trillion extra budgetarily, which is 10% of America's GDP within the month, So Nigeria should follow suit, and that's largely the direction. That's the spirit of the Asiwaju's recommendations.
Now, from his recommendations, he talked about the fact that the current situation that we find ourselves presents a historic chance to establish a more beneficial social contract between the government and the governed. Now, how can we make the best out of this opportunity, looking through what he has presented to us now?
There is the proposals. Some of the proposals relate to the period of the lockdown, while some of the proposals relate to the post-lockdown future, the post-lockdown situation. So we should partition them. The things relating to the lockdown, we may not spend maybe in another 1 month or two, the lockdown will be over. So the things that have been recommended to mitigate the negative consequences of the lockdown are urgent and needs to be done immediately. Whereas those things relating to the post-lockdown social contract between government and people, we can take the time to debate and perfect them so that as the sun sets on the prescriptions for the lockdown, we will then see the sun rising on those post-lockdown initiatives. We would have had time to debate them and digest them better.
Now, let's look at some of the prescriptions like you mentioned. He talked about a diplomatic push for debt relief. And you would recall that recently IMF gave debt relief to some countries, but Nigeria was not one of them. How diplomatic can we go about this, and how challenging do you think it would be?
Yeah, that's not a conversation for the period of lockdown. When IMF's offices itself are not open, that's conversation for when the lockdown ends. And then would be able to debate, that as one of the options on the table for, trying to cope with the economic downsides of the pandemic on the government fiscal situation and the government's ability to protect the populace with necessary palliatives.
All right, we'll leave the discussion here now. Dr. Ayo Teriba, thank you for speaking with us. Dr. Ayo Teriba, economist and CEO Economic Associates, joins me via Skype to talk about this. Thank you for joining us on TVC Breakfast. Well, the APC chieftain says that history would not be kind to us if Nigerians go hungry, and that the relief funds should be paid to household via the BVN. You would recall that there are concerns with regards to the palliatives being put in place, and would this suggestion made by the APC chieftain talking about the use of the BVN bridge the gap and also address the concerns being raised from the palliatives being given so far?
Right. The important point to take is that in a pandemic-induced lockdown that affects everyone, government should extend the palliatives to everyone. You can't afford to be selective. You cannot say that the people we have in our database prior to the pandemic are the ones that we are going to give relief to in a pandemic that affects everybody. So you need to look for, some wider database, and the BVN is one, but by no means the only way of reaching out to the generality of Nigerians. So it's very appropriate, for the national leader to call for using some broader database, of which the BVN is one, but I'm not sure that even that, captures everybody, because that's going to be limiting it only to those who have bank accounts. So you need to use the BVN in addition to any other way in which you want to make sure that those people who go out, just for daily income, that cannot move and cannot associate, are not left out, as the government use these essential palliatives at this time.
All right, two things that you mentioned that I would like for you to also expatiate on is, first, you talked about the fact that the BVN cannot or would not or does not capture everyone, so to speak, and that there are other measures that can be used to achieve that. What measures are you talking about, knowing that the issue of data management in the country has been a major challenge?
Well, the one would agree that the issue of data management, is a challenge. But the relying on, the database of the vulnerable prior to the outbreak of the pandemic is very restrictive, which means it's only those who had been identified as poor prior to the pandemic that we are trying to distribute the palliatives to. That would exclude those that have been made poor by the pandemic, or those that have been temporarily made unemployed by the pandemic. So moving, going through people's bank accounts, we give you a wider spread, capture, those that have been affected by the pandemic. But we not capture everyone. You have the BVN. You also have people's phone lines, find ways, of reaching out to people who may not necessarily, have a bank account, BVN, and trying to reach them through their phones. The poor, have access to the phone. There's inclusion in the telecom space. So, we can't have, we should consider, all practical ways of making sure that everybody is reached, rather than just thinking that one modality, will serve the needs of everybody.
And that is where my next question lies, talking about reaching out to everyone. And you actually put it clearly when you mentioned those that have been made poor by the pandemic, those that have also lost their jobs. But then the question will be that can the government, or does the government have the capacity to reach out to every single person and address this? Can they handle this alone?
Well, we cannot say that government doesn't have the capacity to handle it. If the government had the capacity to take census, to count the population, why would the government not have the capacity to reach out to the population in this time of need when everything is locked down? It's a lockdown situation. The government doesn't really have much else, doing beyond rising up, to the challenges of the pandemic. So if we wanted to reach out to people, we work out the modalities. I'm not saying, that we are prepared for that, but we can quickly rise up, to the situation across the 774 local government areas.
I remember it's a 200 million population we're talking about, but then we'll leave the discussion here now. Dr. Ayo Teriba, thank you so much for speaking with us.